Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about documentary photography. Few quick comments on documentary photography. The documentary photography as an expression came into existence in the 1930s, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, when it was necessary to photograph what was happening across the United States. It was a period of extraordinary poverty, foreclosures, dust storms, crop failures. It was a disaster. But documentary actually, as a concept, precedes that in a number of ways. It's easy to fall into the trap of, it's important to draw a distinction between documentary and photojournalism. Photojournalism is an actual event that has just happened, and you can take a picture of it, and it is a recording of an event that just took place. But documentary transcends that into a greater commentary on what's happening, the goods and the bads, the rights and the wrongs of society. So it must say more than a person's face or a landscape. It really is set apart by the nature of its content, that it can speak to a broader aspect of the world. Now you have a massive list, and I'm going to go through it, but before you panic, I will thin out this list before we get to the midterm and the final. Robert Howlett was a British photographer, and he was assigned to photograph the building of the SS Great Eastern. In his day, it was the biggest steamship in the world, and it was 10 years to build, and he photographed it. So he documented its construction. John Thomas, another English photographer, traveled Asia. He went to Japan, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, and created a photo log of his travels. And then he came back to England and photographed, the desperate poor on the street. And I'll show you some pictures of that as well. For a lot of people, their world wasn't much bigger than the town they'd lived in. It was a time when people didn't travel more than a few miles from the place they were born. And so these photographs were a huge learning curve of how the rest of the world looks. Pictures of pyramids, pictures of giraffe and of elephants, and of people who live on the other side of the world. It was an extraordinary time, and photography brought it home. Felice Beato. Felice Beato was born in what we today call Venice, a part of it that was then controlled by England, so he claimed British citizenship his whole life. He traveled to Egypt, and he photographed the pyramids and the Sphinx, and he brought those pictures back. And later he traveled to China and photographed the Opium Wars. So he's also considered a war photographer. August Sandar was a German photographer, and he decided, we're talking into the 1920s, and he traveled to Germany basically on a bicycle with this camera and photographed. He wanted to get the faces of the people of Germany to see how they live and see who they are, and create this photo diary of the average German. Not long after that, the Nazis came to power, and they didn't like his photography because he photographed average people, not those hyper-perfect Aryans with perfect faces that are all blonde and strong and gorgeous. He fell from grace and had to basically get out of Dodge. A lot of his Jewish friends were being arrested, and he saw the writing on the wall. Hines was an American photographer, and he took it upon himself to travel up and down the East Coast and photograph children at work, which appalled him. And he created a series called Making Human Junk, photographing children just working away in factories or coal mines. There was a series known as the Breaker Boys, boys who were just covered with coal dust because they had to break up coal. Now, most of you, none of you, were holding down 14-hour jobs when you were 10 years old. And you get to thank Louis Hines for that. Jacob Riis was Danish, came to America and landed in New York. At first, he worked for the police, and later he started to photograph the poor of New York and northern New Jersey, where there was a wave of immigrants pouring in, and they had no place to live, and they lived in absolute squalor. So Jacob Riis photographed them. And by photographing them, these pictures brought to the attention of average Americans how people are living just around the block and down the street. Especially going back briefly to Louis Hines, you can attribute to him and thank him for child labor laws, which make sure that kids like you once were didn't have to work in factories under incredibly dangerous conditions. Children then could lose a limb, lose a finger, die, and yeah, so what? Nobody cared. Certainly, well, of course, the family cared, but there was no laws to protect children from this. On your list, you see something that says the Farm Security Administration, or FSA. In 1929, the stock market crashed really badly, and we were thrown into the Depression. It was horrific. People committed suicide on Wall Street. It was a scene. It was like the end of the world for some people. And America was thrown into considerable poverty. The name right below that is Roy Stryker. Roy Stryker was a professor at Columbia University, and he was retained to help document what was going on in America. So he worked for the Farm Security Administration, and he hired several people, including Dorothea Lange, and sent them out basically to document what's going on in America. Dorothea Lange went to the west coast of the United States, and she photographed the famous migrant mother picture, which you'll see in a bit, and all of you have seen before. If nothing else, go down the hallway towards the photography department. There's a big poster of her there. Arthur Rothstein was assigned the Midwest, and he photographed the Dust Bowl when the dust storms were barreling through in the Midwest, and this colossal crop failure. And something he did that got everybody into a lot of trouble. He saw the skull of a steer on a section of dead grass with the horns. He picked it up and he moved it to an area on the other side of him where there was a dry lake bed, and he photographed it. It was a much more dramatic photograph. But the opponents of the FDR administration heard that he had doctored a photograph, and they were saying, you got to turn this off. You got to shut this whole thing down. You know, they're lying with their cameras. Roy Stryker, who was the head of that program, was a bigger than life kind of guy. He had a huge personality and a huge strength of character. And he goes, no, you are not going to do that. And he basically saved the program. Walker Evans had been a lab tech at Columbia University. That's how he knew Roy Stryker. And Roy Stryker retained him to take an 8x10 camera and photograph basically the areas of Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, you know, the poor there. Gordon Parks came on board, and Gordon Parks, a black man, was interviewed by Roy Stryker, and Roy Stryker looked at him and said in his interview, what does America stand for? And Gordon Parks said, well, democracy, of course. And what does democracy mean? Equality, okay. So Roy Stryker slid some money across the table and said, you know, why don't you go get some lunch? And then next door, there's a movie theater. There's a great movie showing. Have some lunch and watch the movie, and then come back here around 3 and we'll talk about, you know, your assignment. Well, Gordon Parks came back at 3. He had been turned away for being black at the restaurant, turned away at the movie theater for being because he was black. And Roy Stryker looked at him and said, so how was lunch? And Roy said, and Gordon Parks said, how was the movie? And Roy Stryker looked at Gordon Parks and said, photograph that. You know, photograph racism, photograph the black story. Get out there and photograph that. And he did. We're going to see Gordon Parks' photographs shortly. W. Eugene Smith had been a World War II photographer, and then he was a Life magazine photographer and worked heavily in documentary photography. Some of his pieces are some of the most famous documentary photographs ever. He photographs, the things we're going to see of his are the country doctor, following a doctor who has to go, basically make house calls in the country. He photographed a village in Spain, a Spanish village, but I think his most noteworthy piece was Minamata, Japan. Minamata, Japan is a community in Japan where everyone fishes out of a bay, and a factory there was dumping mercury into that bay where everybody fishes and eats the fish. And Minamata had a high rate of blindness, death, deformity, all sorts of problems related to mercury poisoning. And he went there to photograph that. The company found out an American photographer had come over here to photograph what they were doing, and their thugs went out and beat him senseless, just beat the living daylights out of Eugene Smith. But the photographs were published, and the company had to do a cleanup and make amends to its local populace. Roger Fenton, now we're into war photography. Roger Fenton was a British photographer. He was the photographer of England. He photographed, Queen Victoria and the family and all the noteworthies. He was the big deal photographer in England of his day. And they sent, at that time, there was a thing called the Crimean War. Crimea has, in recent years, has come into the news again because Russia took it back from Ukraine, basically stole it. And now what happened, how Ukraine got Crimea was in the 1950s, when it was all the Soviet Union. Khrushchev basically gave one part of the Soviet Union to another part of the Soviet Union. He gave Crimea to the Ukraine. And then in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Ukraine was separated and took Crimea with it. And then Putin wanted it back, so he sent in soldiers that were in uniforms without any identification and basically stole Crimea. Watch the news. You got to see this stuff. So Roger Fenton's assignment was to go to Crimea and photograph the war and make it look nice. Pictures of British officers having tea together, relaxing together, or if there's an injury, it's a minor injury of a hand to a soldier and a pretty nurse is tending to it. Make the war look like a nice war. Fenton found a war. And guess what? Wars are not nice. Now, in those days, it was collodion. So he's out there in the blazing heat of Crimea trying to mix up collodion in a wagon. And also collodion was slow. You can't stop a war and get people to stand still to photograph it. So his photographs are of things that aren't moving. His famous photograph is in the Valley of Death, which is a road between two hills and all these cannonballs laying out there. One of the great debates was that staged? And it's believed that it was, because people, in fact, regathered cannonballs that are still useful and to shoot them again. So maybe they just, because there's two photographs of one with the cannonballs gone, but on the other hand, were the cannonballs laid out there to make this shot, or were they just cleaned up after for the two shots? And one of the rocks on the hill basically moved, which indicates that it happened after the sequence of the two photographs was reversed. Robert Capa was Hungarian. A lot of these photographers come out of Hungary. And he was a guy he was a handsome guy who led a pretty rich life of drinking and women, and he photographs a lot of things. He took a couple of photographs we're going to see. One is a Spanish soldier at the Spanish Civil War at the moment he catches a bullet. And a lot of people said that was a staged photograph, but now it's known that it was not staged. We even know who it was. And it was just a lucky photograph for Capa, not so lucky for that soldier. Another thing is that Capa was at the Normandy invasion. He took a camera with him, went in with the soldiers right there in the surf as all the bullets are flying. And photographed the invasion. Now, when invasion was over, the film was handed off to a lab tech to develop it now so it can go back to the United States. He tried to speed dry it with a hair dryer and destroyed most of the film. Only like a few rolls survived, but they became the most famous photographs of the Normandy invasion. We'll see one of those. Margaret Burke White and Lee Miller. We're going to go follow those two in more detail when we get to women in photography. Margaret Burke White studied photography in the United States and decided at the age of 23 that she would be famous. And she photographed, she was able to get into Russia and photograph the Nazis bombing Moscow. She had a chance to go on a bombing mission and photograph American bombers, and apparently those things are not heated. They warned her it's 40 degrees below zero. Whatever you touch, your fingers are going to stick to, so you need to think ahead on that. But she took some of the most famous photographs. Lee Miller had been a model. We'll talk about that later. Both Margaret Burke White and Lee Miller were at the liberation of Nazi death camps and took some of the photographs that were taken there. Joe Rosenthal was in the Pacific, and this is the type of camera he would have carried with him. I'm going to open this thing up. So this is the kind of camera he would have taken with him. His was a 4x5. This is a smaller camera, but it does shoot a larger format of film. His claim to fame is that he was at the top of Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima when the American flag went up. That's one of, let's say, an iconically famous photograph of the American flag going up as the Marines took Iwo Jima. Alfred Eisenstadt. We're going to see a couple pictures of his. They're incredibly famous. One of them is him at the end of World War II with the surrender of Japan. There's a famous photograph of an American sailor just grabbing an American nurse and kissing her in New York City. This became a very famous photograph, and he just happened he grabbed the photograph. You know, timing is everything, by the way. For years, you know, they learned early who the nurse was, but lots of sailors said, "Oh yeah, that was me. That was definitely, I kissed somebody. I kissed her. I'm the one who kissed her." And so they asked each one, "What did you say after you kissed her?" And they all said the same thing. They said this, they said that. One sailor said, "I didn't say anything. I just walked away." And she said, "That's the one. He didn't say a word. He just walked away." It became an iconically famous photograph. The other Eisenstadt photograph was that photograph of Dr. Goebbels glaring at the photographer. Apparently he was smiling at the photographer until somebody tipped him off, "By the way, that photographer is Jewish." And then his whole face went really sinister as he stared at this Jew. You'll recognize that photograph. David Douglas Duncan, photographed in Russia during World War II. And later, the bulk of his photography was in the Korean War. He photographed the Korean War heavily, especially as Americans surged north into North Korea and were surrounded by the Chinese. The Chinese swept across the border, and we were surrounded at a reservoir called Chosin and had basically to change our direction and move to the Sea of Japan, where American ships were lining up to rescue the Americans. It was a wicked cold winter. A lot of people had frostbite, lost limbs. Eddie Adams, Larry Burroughs are Vietnam photographers. Oh, last comment on Robert Capa. Robert Capa basically photographed 5 conflicts, but died in Vietnam. He stepped on a mine and he died instantly. Eddie Adams took another iconic photograph. In 1968, what we now we call the Chinese New Year was called Tet, the season of Tet, which was the New Year in Vietnamese. And everyone expected a quiet season because it's kind of like the Christmas season. But the North Vietnam made a massive offensive into the South and basically nearly overran South Vietnam. And in Saigon, now known as Ho Chi Minh City, they captured one North Vietnamese soldier, and a South Vietnamese general took a gun and said, "This is what we deal, how we deal with these people." And with the cameras rolling and Eddie Adams firing, taking pictures, he shot the guy straight in the head, right in the brain, and killed the guy on the spot. We call that extrajudicial execution, which is a war crime. That general went on to live a nice little life in Orange County, California, after the fall of Vietnam. Larry Burroughs, they say nobody could photograph blood quite like Larry Burroughs. Larry Burroughs was also a Vietnam photographer. He died in a helicopter crash over Laos with Henri Hewitt, another photographer. Henri Hewitt was a French photographer. Steve McCurry. Steve McCurry in the 1970s was a guy with a camera in the Middle East. You know, it's like when you were little and you go to the dentist's office and there was a book called Highlight. It was just like a kid's book. He was struggling on making pictures like that. At that time, Russia had overrun Afghanistan, and Afghanistan fell into radio silence. We knew nothing about what was going on in Afghanistan. And one day, about 3 guys walked up, obvious Afghanis, walked up to Steve McCurry and said, we see you're an American. We see you're a photographer. Come with us and see what the Russians have done to our country. He was terrorized. He thought, we'll get you tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock tomorrow, we'll walk you into the country. And he's like, are these people going to rob me and kill me? They want to take my cameras? What's going on? Is this a bad idea or what? Afghanistan is one of those Middle Eastern countries where you can be a blue-eyed person and you still mix. And they dressed him as an Afghani and walked him into the country, and he photographed what the Russians were doing in Afghanistan. And he got the film to his brother. His brother took the film, developed, to Newsweek or Time, I can't remember which, and said, I have a brother in Afghanistan. You want to look at the pictures? And they said, yeah. They looked at the pictures and they published these pictures, and then, the rest is world history. It is rare for a person with 2 cameras to change the course of world history. Steve McCurry did it. Robert Doisneau was a French street photographer. There's this thing called street photography. I've got a partial list here, but we'll go into it in more depth when we get to photography after 1950. He was a French street photographer. I love his stuff because it's so funny and friendly and upbeat and happy. Robert Frank was a photographer in America. He came from Europe. He's Jewish. And he traveled America, and he created a book called The Americans. If this class were meeting in a classroom, I'd have that book for you to flip through. Sorry. And so he grew up around America and photographed Americans, his perception of what Americans are like, the loneliness of Americans, the segregation of America, etc. And he'd go into towns in the South, and the sheriff would come up and say, boy, you best be out of here by sundown. More than once he was arrested for just being Jewish, which, is not a crime. But he created his book, The Americans. Susan Meisalis graduated from college in the New York area. And one of her first things to do was to teach classes on survival for journalists overseas. And then later she became a photojournalist, and she went to Central America and to El Salvador and photographed the Civil War there. Weegee was a photojournalist. I should actually have saved him for photojournalism. He may surface again during when we get to photojournalism in New York City. And, you know, there would be a police report. The police would go there. There'd been a killing. And there's Ouija with his camera finishing taking his pictures. And he'd say, I'm all done here. It's all yours. Magically, he was where the crime was before the police could get there. And that's why they started calling him Ouija, as in Ouija board. How did he know? Well, the truth is, he got his hands on a police radio, and he had loaded camera and film in the trunk of his car, and he'd drive around New York City, and he'd hear a police report of a killing. He would drive right there, speed right there, pull out his camera, and get the shots right away, and get the film and develop it at home really fast, or develop it in his trunk really fast, and get it to the newspapers, and he made a living that way. Vivian Maier. Vivian Maier, there's a documentary called Looking for Vivian Maier, which I would encourage all of you to see. You can probably find it, you know, online, stream it online, probably on Netflix, I suppose. I'll find out. Vivian Maier was an au pair, which means she lived in people's homes and took care of their children. She was born in 1928 or 29. And so in New York City, she was an au pair. Also in the Chicago area, she was an au pair. And so every day she'd take the kids out for little outings. And what the family didn't know is she took these kids into really dodgy neighborhoods with her camera. So here's this funny woman with a seemingly French accent, a big floppy hat and a dress, with two little children in tow. And she'd walk into dodgy neighborhoods with her camera and photograph and photograph and photograph. She grew old. She never married. She had basically no friends or no apparent immediate family. She must have had, you know, parents, but no one knew who her family was. And she had a ton of stuff. She put it all into storage. She went into a convalescent home. She passed away. And then because the bill wasn't being paid on the storage, sorry about that. They opened up her storage and put it up for auction. The guy found it and went through it and said, whoa, this stuff's really good. And basically found about 150,000 negatives and rolls of unprocessed film, and movies too, little movies. Today, Vivian Maier is seen as one of the most important street photographers of the 20th century. Initially, he contacted museums and said, I have this fantastic collection of film. And everybody's like, nah, don't worry about it. We're too busy with other things. So he had to do it himself. He printed and mounted and made shows. And her stuff has now been shown in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, London, and been in Paris. It's the big deal. Vivian Maier is the big deal. The documentary, again, is called Looking for Vivian Maier. Lee Friedlander, street photographer. We'll see some of his stuff. Relied heavily on reflections to help tell his commentary on American society. Diane Arbus didn't photograph the beautiful people. We'll look at some of her photographs. She photographed really peculiar photos. The twins, the little boy in the park holding two plastic toy grenades. The seedier side of New York City. Ultimately, she took her own life. It took them a couple of days to find her after she divorced. Have you ever watched MASH? And sometimes a character comes through MASH, the show MASH, who's a psychiatrist named Dr. Freeman. That actor was her husband. And they divorced, and then she took her own life. Gary Winogrand was a street photographer. When he passed away, they found like 3,800 rolls of film. He just shot constantly. He was always photographing, and his wife was like, you know, there he is with this camera again. Lizette Modell learned photography with her sister, and she went on to photograph average people. These are documentaries on average and documents of average people on the street. Now, I want to talk briefly about war photography. Why would you photograph during a war? Documentation, spy. This is a World War II approach map for Japan. And these maps are made from photographs. This is an approach map. So you can see how it would look when you're approaching in a plane. I can't really hold it up here. These are also made from photographs. So you would photograph it, and then you can expand it and then print it all out and make something which is then handed off to bombing missions. So I'm going to, if I can, here, start a PowerPoint. I'll pull this upside down, that's my problem. Let's see if this works. Sorry, slow to open. Sorry, the little. I want to get this thing out of my screen. My apologies here. I've got something totally in the way of my view here. Okay, so damn it, I've lost everything here. Let's see if this works this time. I apologize. I think I swore into the camera. Forgive me. Okay, cool. Documentary photography. So this is a family as their son is dying of AIDS. Now, this body in front of you was a 15-year-old boy who basically whistled at a white girl in the South and was beaten to death. And when they were going to bury him, the mother said, "Oh, I don't want a closed coffin. I want them to see what they did to my child." And this is documentary photography of starvation in Africa. You know, look at the ribs on the person on the left. This is called paparazzi photography. It was a paparazzi who basically stalked Jackie Onassis, and he tapped his horn and she looked at him, but she hated him. She once said, "Smash his camera." This may be the most famous photograph of Tiananmen Square, when a single person stood in the path of a column of tanks so that they wouldn't move. That probably didn't go well for him. The destruction of the Hindenburg. This will actually read material under journalism. This is a child at a checkpoint in Afghanistan. This man's child has been beaten to death in South Africa. Now, this is a starving child, and about 15 feet off, there's a vulture waiting for the death to be complete so he can pick at this body. And there was a strong debate. Do you pick up the child and lift him up and bring him food, or what do you do? That's what I would say. War photography. What else do you do with a Pepsi bottle? There's a Molotov cocktail about to get thrown. And on a lighter note, the glamorous life of the Kennedys on their yacht. This was taken in 1972 at the Munich Olympics when terrorists captured the entire Israeli team and ended up killing all of them. This is the execution. Iranian soldiers are executing, have done a firing squad. This is Chairman Mao of China swimming in the Yangtze. He's in the foreground. A family trying to escape during a fire, and the fire escape collapses and they all fall to their death. Hitler, our favorite nightmare, at a march in Germany. And this is Obama, Biden, and Hillary when they captured at the attack to capture Osama bin Laden. This is a 5-year-old child who drowned with all of the refugees trying to escape Syria. A drowned 5-year-old on the beach. Harry Benson took this picture of the Beatles basically having a pillow fight. Now that's a contrast. How about that? And in America, attacks on civil rights, attacks during a civil rights demonstration. This is called 59.5 Mulberry Street, which is considered a really bad neighborhood in New York. This is a East German soldier escaping the wall before the Berlin Wall went up. He lived with guilt all his life. He was pretty miserable after he did this. 1970, Kent State, Ohio. This will probably turn up again under photojournalism. You've seen this before when we talked about symbol and meaning, the post coming out of her head and how that was later airbrushed. This is Allende of Chile, minutes before he was assassinated. Travel photography. Robert Howlett, The Great Eastern. This is the Great Eastern being built. And as you can see, it is a steamship and it's absolutely flat out huge. When you look at this, remember cyanotypes making instructions, identical instructions for building something huge, like blueprints. This is Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was the shipbuilder of the Great Eastern. And those are the links of the anchor behind him. This is Robert Howlett himself. He died at the age of 27, fairly young guy. A lot of people said he died of chemistry, of exposure to photochemistry. Now it's believed he died of typhus. John Thompson, he traveled Southeast Asia and Asia. This is taken in Japan. So for people in Europe, this was a big eye opener. This was in, I believe, China. This is a little Vietnamese girl. Japan. This is back in England, and this woman is what they call a crawler. Who get so hungry they can't even walk, they just have to crawl for food. And she's holding somebody else's child for the day. So this would be 19th century daycare. The mother has to go to work and has no place to leave her child. So for a small amount, she can leave her child with this woman on the street. Imagine that happening today. Now, when you're out on the street, most of you don't know what sleet is. Sleet is a mixture of snow and rain, and it's wicked cold. So this child is out in the elements all day. Luis Beato traveled to Egypt, and he also recorded China's Opium Wars. So this is Egypt. And by the way, look at the people compared to these columns, especially this one. These are huge. I've been to Egypt, and I can tell you they're really impressive. I loved Egypt. Those squares you see in the pyramid, those things are about 5 feet tall. I climbed up a few of them before I was told to get off of there. But you know, it is a climb. It is not like stairs at all. And this is more from Japan on from these are the Opium Wars, the Chinese Opium Wars. And this is the French side before they attacked a fortress. And this is the Chinese death toll on the other side. Remember, film was slow. You couldn't photograph a war in action. You could only photograph the aftermath. Aldrin, photographed by Neil Armstrong, 1969. Interesting point to remember, Armstrong had the camera. There are no pictures of Neil Armstrong except for the movie camera, the television camera. Every picture taken is of Aldrin, although if you look closely in the helmet of Aldrin, you'll see a reflection of Neil Armstrong. August Sandar, Faces of Our Time. He photographed Germany. And these were the people who lived in Germany. Now, this is a mistake. Some chiropractor's going, oh, no, don't do that. He's going to have back problems. So he traveled Germany on bicycle and photographed the average German in the 1920s. And this is the baker, a farmer selling seed. So these are average people in Germany in the 1920s. And that's August Sandar. And he was basically told by the Nazis, you're not doing that anymore. We don't approve of your stuff. He was going to make a book that people could buy of photographs, portraits, documentation of life in Germany. Hines. Louis Hines is the guy who travels up and down the East Coast, photographing children in factories. And it's from him we get child labor laws. I mean, how old do you think these kids are? Like maybe 10, maybe 11 or 12? What do you think? They're too young to be at work. They should be in school. Sorry about the condition of this photograph. I pulled it off the line. These are the breaker boys, boys who basically break up coal. This is maybe the saddest photograph I've ever seen in my life. Just look at this child. It's a heartbreak. And I'm not afraid of heights, but I can't see myself sitting up there like that, having lunch. And today, this guy would have all sorts of harnesses and straps and a helmet. When I first saw this, I thought he was losing his balance, but I guess he's giving directions to somebody running a crane. Wow. Jacob Riis from Denmark had photographed for the police, and he photographed the poor, the immigrants in New York and New Jersey, in the tenement living. This is actually a slum in New Jersey and how everybody, multiple families are packed together into one space. This is also New Jersey. School. And that's Jacob Riis. The Farm Security Administration, or FSA. Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange, and I'm going to cover her also when I get to women in photography. She and her friend decided to go around the world, got their money together, made it from the East Coast to New York, where they were robbed. Somebody picked their pocket and took all their money. So they're stuck in San Francisco. And so she got a job working as a lab tech in a small photographic studio. And there she became a photographer. She was retained by Roy Stryker to travel the West Coast photographing the poor in the United States, how people lived. This is called Migrant Mother. It is her most famous photograph. The woman's name was Florence Thomas. And there are conflicting stories about how this picture was done. It has been said that Dorothea Lange, was at the end of the day, she was driving back and she drove past a little entrance and she saw some kind of sign, and just on a whim, she drove back and found this woman out there, and her children would go out and basically steal food from the field or kill pigeons and bring them home to eat. And all the children turned their heads away. So you can see some of the children are looking at her. And Florence Thomas survived. This is Florence Thomas, the old lady sitting in the chair. It's Florence Thomas years later. And I like to call this photograph Florence Thomas Made It. But her this photograph was all over America and she didn't even know it. It was put in newspapers and magazines about what's happening in America. And she didn't even know this photograph was out there. But she did survive. Now, in World War II, Japanese Americans were rounded up, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered this and sent to what they called internment camps, so that they could be not working as spies or what have you for the Japanese forces. The peculiar thing to remember is that Japanese Americans were actually intensely loyal to the United States. So here's a sad picture of this girl pledging allegiance to the United States, to the very country that's holding her in Manzanar. So they were all marched up. Manzanar is actually in Northern California. I've been there. It can be really, really cold in the winter. Now, let's add to this point for a second. Their sons and brothers and fathers are fighting for the United States in Europe, but their families are still being marched up to these internment camps and being held, and they can't be trusted. This is one of Dorothea Lange's famous photographs of men in a soup line. This guy turns around, he absolutely denotes hopelessness. That's how a snapshot can be a documentary photograph. It speaks of sheer hopelessness. I apologize for the condition of this photograph. Again, I pulled it offline. And this building is scheduled to be destroyed because it's in the way of the fields. That's Dorothea Lange photographing from the roof of her car. And here she is talking to her second husband. They became an impressive team. He was a writer, and he would take her with him to photograph the situations that he was writing about for the Farm Security Administration. A little out of order here, my fault. That's Dorothea Lange later in life. Arthur Rothstein was as I mentioned earlier, was also part of the FSA, and he worked the Midwest. So here's people running to their shed, which they turned into a home during the dust storms, which were intense. And a family living out of a car in the Midwest. This is what a dust storm could look like. It would literally darken the sky till it was black. This is not nighttime. This is an approaching dust storm. People would die in a dust storm only 20 feet from their home because they couldn't see anything and the dust would choke them. Oops, sorry about that. And this is how these people lived in this little shed. Now, this is the photograph that got everyone in so much trouble. Rothstein saw this on dry, dead grass and moved it to a cracked lake bed or pond, or where a pond had been, and all the earth is cracked, and took a very dramatic photograph. Then it was discovered by those detractors of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration that this was done, and they complained vociferously that these photographs were all rigged. Only the strength of Roy Stryker's personality saved the situation. And this is a sharecropper who's been evicted and has to just kick out all their stuff and go away. Walker Evans, as I mentioned earlier, was a darkroom tech at Columbia, where Royce, and that's how he knew Roy Stryker. He took an 8x10 camera and traveled the South. Now, in a few weeks, we're going to compare small and large format cameras. And you'll realize that large format cameras are not quick. You know, you really have to set up your shot and plan ahead. They're not that spontaneous. I look at this photograph and I wonder if she still has teeth. This is the mark of the 8x10 camera. Look at all the detail in his beard and his mustache, and his skin for that matter. People in line for food. Now, an 8x10 camera takes a better picture than this, but these were pulled off than that, and it didn't come out as good as I wanted, with the quality and resolution I'd hoped for. People built log cabins then. And that is Walker Evans. Gordon Parks. As I told you, Gordon Parks was also part of the FSC. He was one of the last to get hired. And he created photographs that talk about America in terms of the segregation and the disenfranchising of the Black community. So this would be based on that photograph called not American Classic, but the one of the old couple holding a pitchfork. So this woman's got her broom and her mop and a big American flag behind her. A child at home in a shot building, reading. Family together. Little girl with her white doll. And these are women who are Black Muslims of faith. Nurses, I think. He also photographed a certain amount of fashion and made, you know, he had to make an income as well. That's Ingrid Bergman, starlet. And that's Muhammad Ali, formerly known as Cassius Clay, boxer. Malcolm X, a police officer in New York. I believe that's a New York uniform. And that's Gordon Parks. That's also Gordon Parks. He had a very successful life, became a filmmaker too. This is a photograph of Dr. Schweitzer. He was a doctor in Africa who would come back to America and play concerts to raise money for his clinic in Africa. W. Eugene Smith. That is not a Gordon Parks photograph. W. Eugene Smith. Oh, sorry about the typo. The country doctor, Life magazine. I gotta correct that. And this, he followed a country doctor going out on his rounds. A person with an amputated leg. A child who suffered a significant head injury. Looking at an x-ray with the father. Minamata, Japan. Now, as you'll recall, that is a bay in Japan where they dump mercury and people fish out of the bay. So we're dealing with lots of photographs of people who have horrific deformity from the mercury. That's a mercury poisoning deformity. So is this. And when I was little, I remember this photograph in Life magazine. This woman was bathing her 17-year-old daughter who's blind and deaf and has multiple complications from mercury. That's W. Eugene Smith setting the shot. Spanish Village, Life magazine, 1948. Life in a Spanish village. Local soldiers, local police force, a death. Those are Eugene Smith's children walking away. And this is as he was recovering from the traumas of his life, including being beaten in Minamata, Japan. War photography. This is Japan invades Manchuria, the Crimean War. So this is a Roger Fenton photograph. And if you look along the railroad tracks, you'll see a blur. Those are people walking towards the camera. That'll tell you how long the exposure was. You couldn't, unless people stood still, you couldn't get a clear shot of people. So this is in the Valley of Death. You can see all the cannonballs around. And it was argued or suggested that this was a staged photograph, that he put the cannonballs there for drama. China. So this is Felice Bieto and the Opium Wars. We already looked at one of his photographs. The Civil War. Gettysburg. Thousands died at Gettysburg in 3 days. That doesn't mean you can bury thousands of people in 3 days. So it took a while to deal with it, and so their bodies decayed and decayed and decayed and decayed. This is a stereoscopic photograph. It's called A Group of Contrabands. And this is after the North overran a line on the South. This was done by a photographer named Alexander, and it's called The Southern Sniper. This was a staged photograph. They found a body, dragged it over, they found a gun and set it up, and they said, this is the Southern Sniper. It was a propaganda photograph. Now, propaganda is an interesting word. It comes from the word to propagate or to spread. We think of propaganda only as the telling of lies, but it is to spread information or to spread a lie, if you will. This is called the Hood Ordinance. Ordinance is a word for bullets and gunpowder, explosives and bombs. And they blew up this train tracks to ruin the ordnance. More Gettysburg. World War I faces. World War I was a nightmare. A lot of people, their faces were just destroyed. And as one soldier put it, I can never go home. My mother can never see me like this. So an American sculptor started making molds of faces so they could wear this mask that would put their face largely back in order. So they could actually have a life and go out in public rather than people staring and pointing and being horrified. People can be cruel. World War II. This is Robert Capa's photograph of a Spanish soldier in the Spanish Civil War the moment he takes a bullet. And it has been confirmed that this is not staged. The Nazis invade the fall of France. The Nazis roll into Paris. Look how much is being said in this photograph in the eyes of everybody, including the man who's breaking down in the middle. This is a document. Pearl Harbor. This is the destruction of the Arizona. Hitler and his comrades marching up. That's General Douglas MacArthur, who was the ranking general in the Pacific Theater and later in Korea, before he was fired by Harry Truman. He was fired because he said we should drop the atomic bomb on China. And Truman said, nope. Now, this is the Eisenstadt photograph I mentioned earlier, where this is Dr. Joseph Goebbels, who came up with the plan to kill all of the Jews. And he was smiling at the photographer, and somebody said, by the way, do you know that guy's Jewish? And suddenly he just looked really ugly. And that's a Jew, huh? This is Mussolini, also known as El Duce of Italy. He actually came to power before Hitler. Here are the big three as they realize they're winning the war. On the left is Winston Churchill. In the middle is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On the right is Joseph Stalin as they're deciding how to divide Europe. Robert Capa at the Normandy invasion. As I told you, these are one of the very few photographs that actually survived that. They say Robert Capa never took a big risk. I would call riding into the Normandy invasion a colossal risk. Thousands died, thousands. But not a lot of the film was destroyed by a very, I wouldn't say ambitious, but perhaps overworked lab tech, rushed lab tech, who used a hair dryer to dry the film and destroyed a lot of film with a hair dryer. So these are the defining photographs of the Normandy invasion. This photograph is of an Australian prisoner of war at the moment of his execution. And a Japanese soldier took this picture and took this film to a Chinese photo lab, and the Chinese were not sympathetic to the Japanese at all. They saw this photograph, made multiple prints, and smuggled them out of China so that the West, the Allies, could know what was happening, in the prisoner of war camps of Japan. This picture speaks for itself. This is the sinking of a submarine, sinking of a ship as photographed from a submarine. This is a death camp liberated. Margaret Burke-White took this at Buchenwald. I think this is a Lee Miller photograph. This is a Margaret Burke-White photograph. And Lee Miller took this photograph at Dachau. So this was taken in the South Pacific on one of the islands that we invaded. So these are American Marines who died at the beach. This is the fall of Berlin as the Russians took Berlin. And one of these soldiers, I think maybe the guy in the foreground, had 3 watches on. So he was basically stealing watches from people he killed or from Nazi bodies, and they airbrushed out or retouched out the other watches. So he only had 1 watch on, they say. American soldiers march into Paris. Prisoners of war finally released. They've been starved over a number of years. More prisoners of war having been liberated. With the fall of Germany, these are American and Russian soldiers meeting as they had crushed the Nazi line, and Nazi line had to retreat. This is a picture of a Nazi collaborator being exposed and charged and challenged on a death camp. You can tell that from the clothes of the person on the far left is striped. And this woman had slept with the Nazis. She's got a child that was fathered by a Nazi. They shaved her head so that she can't hide as her part of her humiliation. Joe Rosenthal. This is Joe Rosenthal, an army photographer at Iwo Jima. And this is the raising of the flag over Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. He took this picture. It is said the flag was already up and he walked up there anyway and found the flag going up. They had changed the pole or something like that. But this became the iconic photograph. And again, after he took this picture was all over America in a flash. Also, in 24 hours, half these soldiers will be dead. That's Joe Rosenthal. And this is a battle scene. This is the mushroom cloud going up over Nagasaki, the end of the war. America is victorious. This is a woman who survived Hiroshima. Alfred Eisenstadt, the guy who photographed Joseph Goebbels. And this is the iconic photograph of the end of the war. A sailor grabs a nurse and kisses her, and then walks away. Eisenstadt took this picture. That's Alfred Eisenstadt. Korea. Got to tell you, at the end of World War II, they said, oh, that was got to be the last war because that was so huge. As we know now, not. This is a photograph of a soldier who's lost his best friend in battle and he's being consoled. This is a soldier who's just been released from a prisoner of war camp who can't believe who's been a prisoner of war for almost a year and now he's free and he can't believe he's got food in front of him. These are soldiers taking communion. Churchill. David Douglas Duncan. This is David Douglas Duncan, who photographed in Russia during World War II and then heavily photographed the Korean War. So this is at the Battle of Chosin, which is a reservoir in North Korea. And this is a commanding officer who's just been told we basically run out of bullets and we're surrounded. And they're moving through the brush trying to get to another position. And this is a guy who's just been told we're surrounded, we're out of bullets, we got no hope. And it was incredibly cold there. And they're getting off the mountain, getting away from the reservoir, trying to escape. Vietnam. This soldier took an incredibly lucky deck of cards and stuck in his helmet thinking the luck of those cards might protect him. This was at Da Nang in Vietnam. This woman has just discovered that the body in the bag in front of her is her husband. This is a Buddhist monk who, in protest of the war, set fire to himself and had the composure to sit there as he burned, and finally just fell over dead. And this is protest of the war. A child burned from napalm, which is gelatinized gasoline. This photograph was done by Don McCullum, and there was a North Vietnamese soldier, and this is actually a doctored photograph in that his stuff was spread all around him. So he gathered up his stuff and put it next to him for this photograph, including a picture of perhaps either a sister or a girlfriend back in the North. This child's clothes caught on fire from napalm. The story is her brother tore her clothes off and now they're running for safety. Her clothes were burned, but now she's safe. This is My Lai, Vietnam. It was a massacre of an entire community by American soldiers in March 1968. And the American soldiers kept their mouths shut because you could be basically court-martialed. And once they were out of the army, they said, by the way, did you know that we killed a whole village in My Lai and it turned into a trial? Vietnamese hiding in the pit, in the ditch. Eddie Adams. Now this is February 1st, 1968, and it's called the Tet Offensive, when the North Vietnamese basically overran the South. They've caught a Viet Cong soldier and they're bringing him to this is Eddie Adams. And they're marching him up. And that is a South Vietnamese general who held a gun to his head, he said, this is how we deal with these people. And he shot him right in the head and blew his head out. They say that when this photograph ran in the United States, we lost the war in Vietnam that night because Americans said, who are these people? Are we really on their side? This is just wrong. An American photojournalist, and basically waist deep in the water. Larry Burroughs. Larry Burroughs died in Vietnam in a helicopter crash. And this was, I think this is Hamburger Hill, which we lost. We gave up, we took it back. It was called Hamburger Hill for the just sheer loss of human life on this one hill. And this is a gunship, a helicopter that's just gotten shot up badly from the ground below, and a bunch of Americans died right there. The expression on this soldier's face speaks volumes. Now, this is interesting in that I've been to the Southeast Asia and whole families will ride on one motorcycle together. They'll just stack up the whole family, you know, couple on the handlebars, couple behind, mom's holding one on the gas tank. This is not unusual. That's Larry Burroughs. And this is another one of his photographs. You saw this already. But he shot it in color. And they're carrying an American soldier to a helicopter to get him out of there. The fall of Vietnam, May 1975. Where basically, after many years of war, the president of South Vietnam tells the Americans to leave. And we didn't know if he negotiated some separate peace or what. So these are people who are trying to get out of Saigon, and the loading of helicopters to fly them out to American aircraft carriers. And people trying to escape before the North Vietnamese overrun it. The ships were loaded with refugees, packed with refugees trying to get out. And I apologize for the conditions photograph, but I pulled it off the net. It was the aircraft carriers were so full that they couldn't even keep their helicopters. They would push them into the sea. They had no place where the aircraft was landing. So they would just push these perfectly good helicopters into the Bay of Tonkin. This is a North Vietnamese tank blowing through the gates of the American embassy as Vietnam fell. This is my apologies. This is a MASH unit hospital for the North Vietnamese in a mangrove swamp not far from Saigon. And the surgical unit works under a mosquito netting. They're bringing in another North Vietnamese soldier who's been shot to work on. And these are North Vietnamese soldiers overrunning an area. The South Vietnamese soldiers stripped off their uniforms and abandoned any identification that they were South Vietnamese soldiers for their own protection because they knew they were falling to the north. These are two old ladies who've been separated from the North and the South for all their lives, finally reuniting. This is the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where the North fed supplies to the South through the jungle. This is a practiced assault by North Vietnamese. This is a downed American fighter jet, and they're picking through it for things they can use. This woman is 24 years old and twice widowed by the war. And now she is a North Vietnamese combatant. These are women who are training to fight for the North. They're wearing masks so they don't know each other and can never identify each other if they're captured. This is a recruitment in North Vietnamese for soldiers for the North. These are American soldiers in a swamp area, crossing a river, bringing the wounded out on a tank. South Vietnamese soldiers who are just exhausted. They're hoisting an injured soldier up on a cable, which you can't see, to a helicopter. It looks like he's been thrown out, but he's actually being hauled up. And these are soldiers guiding a helicopter where to land to take the wounded out. And after the fall of Vietnam, prisoners of war are released and come back to their families in America. Steve McCurry. I told you the story of Steve McCurry already. He was photographing in Pakistan when people came up to him and said, "We see you're an American, we see you're a photographer, come with us and see what the Russians have done to our country." They smuggled him in, and these are Taliban soldiers looking over a column of Russian trucks, and he photographed them. And this is really heavily children soldiers. Which is disturbing in its own right. This is a shocker. This child's lost both his legs, being held by his father. At the end of the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein decided to destroy the world, and he set fire to 500 oil rigs, over 500 oil rigs. And so we had to put out 500 oil rig fires, which is a huge deal in its own right. Now, this photograph, I was showing my portfolio to Time magazine when this photograph came into Time magazine. Time magazine had shown a photograph of an incinerated American soldier after the failed rescue of the hostages in Iran, and took a lot of heat for it. So they were about to they were deciding whether or not to run this photograph. The woman interviewing me was pulled out for an emergency editorial meeting, and it was apparently over this photograph, whether or not they should even show this photograph. So Kuwait burns, thank you for nothing, Saddam. He decided to destroy the world with an environmental catastrophe. Street photography, Robert Doisneau. He was a French photographer. And apparently she's a woman who does not know she's being photographed, does not appreciate it. Here's one of his claims to fame. I'm sure you've all seen this photograph at one time or another. And it was also suggested that this was staged, but apparently it's not. If you look at the contact sheet, it's just one out of many photographs. In my view, she's practically posing for the camera. She's looking right into the camera. That's Picasso on the left. That is a long dive. We already saw this. I apologize for that. A little cheating going on here. That's funny. And that's Robert Dawson. Robert Frank. Everybody in this picture has, and it got their own little picture frame denoting the separation of these people by class. Notice that the back half of the train is black and the front half is white. Person getting these shoes shined in the men's room. A funeral. Robert Frank drove all over America. A funeral again. Life in America in the 50s. Orange whip, 10 cents. That's probably like a 25-cent hamburger then. A couple. Teenage couple. That's Robert Frank. Susan Marsalis. She went to Central America and photographed in El Salvador, a civil war. That woman, that cart is her husband. And people had to conceal their identity so they wouldn't be identified by the authorities when photographed. Sorry about that. Same thing here, concealed identities. And these are paper bombs you can throw and will detonate. That's brave. Teenagers in America. That is Susan Marsalis. Ouija. Arthur Fog. Photographed New York City. That's a picture of Ouija. He would drive all over New York City. And so he would hear the police reports and he was there before anybody. So he got a good commentary on New York. Vivian Maier had a twin lens camera, so she could look down and then look up and photograph people making eye contact with her. They didn't actually fully know they're being photographed. Apparently this kid gets it. This girl's eyes know where, she knows where the lens is. So this is a good commentary on New York and Chicago in the 40s and the 50s. That is Vivian Maier. And that's the kind of camera she used, a Rolleiflex. Lee Friedlander, photographed in New York City. It's beautiful. On the streets. This is one example of what I meant by the kind of reflections that shows a double image, exploring the duality and the dichotomy of American existence. That's Friedlander. Diane Arbus, photographed in New York City. Teenagers. People from all walks of life. This is the famous photograph of the child holding a plastic grenade in a park. And as they say, this kid she didn't ask the kid to do it. He just sort of did it for the camera. That is Diane Arbus. This is her twins photo, famous twins photograph. Gary Winogrand. So flip phones, go back in time. This is a carefree picture of Southern California. Nice sun, happy face. This is a photograph that he took when people were saying that you can't really marry out of your race. And these people set up this demonstration of no, of course we can't. What do you think we're going to do? Have monkeys? That's Gary Winogrand. Lizette Modell. She didn't photograph people for being beautiful. She learned photography with her sister and then pursued it on her own. Also went out and photographed people from all walks of life. And this is not one of her photographs, but I had to, after all you've seen, leave you with a hippo surfing. Let me put that away. Stop sharing. Here I am, I'm back. Okay, so that's documentary. And as I said, don't panic over the sheer list of names. I'm going to abbreviate. I'm also going to pursue some of those names in more detail when we get to women in photography later. I hope that was enjoyable. This will be available next week, the week of the 6th, which is when you need to be watching this one. I'll be sending out an email to all of you when it's up. End.